Before we kick off a brand new series of coming out stories, let's revisit another great one from the past. From What Goes On Media, this is Coming Out Stories. It's a podcast about one of the most important conversations of your life. I'm Emma Goswell. You're going to hear an incredibly powerful story now from Oskar, who found happiness eventually but struggled with drug addiction, homelessness and mental health problems.
How I identify is constantly evolving, really, but at the moment I identify as trans-masculine, non-binary. Sexuality-wise, I pretty much identify as pansexual, but I do tend to say I'm bisexual just for the ease of not having to have a long conversation about it.
Fair enough. So when you say non-binary, you're obviously dressing and looking very masculine today, but does that mean some days you feel a bit more feminine? Or
I think it's important for people to realise, whether they're feeling in a particular way or not, that identity is really an internal thing, not necessarily how you look to other people. For me, a non-binary is that you see gender on a spectrum, which is basically how I've always thought of gender. And so nobody is absolutely male or absolutely female. There's always a mix of the two. And there's also the complication that gender is on some part also a collection of ideas about how you look or react to other people. So I feel like me a lot of the time. Sometimes I feel more of the old me than I feel of the new me. I mean, it's a very complicated question, basically. Also, like, as I gotten older, the idea that I am me in isolation to the world is a bit ridiculous. So, like, I am me in contact with people and situations at any given moment. So my identity is as fluid as my gender.
And you've had quite a few coming out stories, haven't you, really?
Yeah, I've had a series of coming out stories. So initially I came out as a lesbian. As I was growing up, there was very little language or information about identities other than heterosexual binary gender identities. And
tell us where and when you were growing up.
Well, I was born in the 70s, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and still growing up. But I was born in the Midlands in the UK, and then when I was about 4, we moved to Trinidad in the West Indies, which is where my father's from.
Okay. And what was it like, spending your formative years and your childhood, really, in the Caribbean?
It was, in many ways, idyllic. It's a beautiful island, and it's possibly one of the few places in the world which really celebrates a mixed race identity. Obviously, I'm mixed race. I'm many different ethnicities. And Trinidad is one of the few places I've been that genuinely celebrates that.
That's good, but do they understand gay people? Because initially you were growing up as a woman and you came out as a lesbian. How did that feel? Yeah,
I mean, I didn't really come out until after I left Trinidad, because I was 11 when I left. My mum brought us back to the UK. I mean, I was just touching on the edges of it. So when I was in Trinidad, we started to have the first sort of stories coming out about the AIDS crisis. So I remember that happening. And that was probably the first time I'd ever really come into contact with the idea that, a man could love a man and a woman could love a woman. It was a confusing and also exciting time, because I was starting to recognize something of myself in the stories of the people that I was hearing about, but also there's this terrible thing happening, and essentially there's lots of rhetoric about whether or not this was something that was supposed to happen, if it was a good thing, or did God punishing gays, that kind of stuff. So,
and was it quite a homophobic place then, do you think?
Yeah, well, Trinidad been changing over the last few years. They had their first Pride last year, 2 years ago.
Great.
The groups who are campaigning for rights, LGBT plus rights in that country are very vocal, and they're getting a lot of coverage, so that's very positive. But it is a very conservative, religious country in the sense that there are lots of very vocal, strongly opinionated, mainly Christian groups. It's a hotbed of activity for Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists and evangelical Christians who come to do their missions, like missionary stuff.
Okay.
So the kids are they're very active down there.
So what was it like going to school in Trinidad then?
It was intense.
Why?
We have a very intense educational program that pushes kids a lot. It was a difficult time, mainly because I was bullied a lot in school for being different. As they saw, I was a very masculine girl who hung around with boys and didn't really do lots of girl stuff, which made me different.
Did they call you names?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just like teasing. Girls would say things to make me feel like I didn't really fit in or like wasn't doing girl right. There were some physical moments, but mainly it was just like low-level humiliation, that kind of stuff. So,
and you were sort of processing the fact that you thought you were gay. You thought you were a lesbian.
Well, yeah. I mean, I knew I was different. I knew I wasn't acting the same way that girls acted, but also at that point I hadn't really got the language for a lot of how I was identifying. So
So you weren't necessarily questioning your gender at that point, or were you?
Oh yeah, well I was questioning my gender from the time I was a child. So I basically thought I was a boy up until, because as I started to hit primary school I had to wear a dress because I was a girl, and up until that point I didn't have to. My mum has she's not as strongly set in her gender roles either, so she identified herself as a tomboy. When she grew up, she wanted to be a cowboy.
Wonderful. So, she sounds great.
Yeah, she was brilliant.
How was it when you had to suddenly wear a dress then? I imagine that was horrific.
It was, yeah. I wore shorts underneath my dresses quite often as a way of like protecting myself. But yeah, I hated it. And also like when I was teased for being in a dress, that was like even more upsetting because I was already vulnerable in a dress and then I was being made fun of because I was wearing a dress. So.
And did you feel like you were just wearing the wrong clothes when you wore a dress?
Yes, basically. Yeah. I mean...
Oscar, you're just lucky you didn't have my mother, because I didn't have a school uniform. And my mother invented this thing called Dress Tuesdays, and she used to make me wear a dress on a Tuesday.
Oh my gosh.
Do you know what I did? Run and hide.
Yeah,
Get up really early. Yeah. And then it would happen on a Wednesday. She's like, you didn't wear a dress yesterday. Got to wear one today.
I would absolutely have, yeah. I mean, I had to wear a dress as my school uniform, so I just sucked it up. That's what I did. I had to wear a dress for my first Holy Communion. That was horrific. I mean, I only wore it because my mum made it. But it was like, that was a terrible, terrible time. And then I had one dress that I had to wear. I think I was on my 6th birthday, and I think that was probably the last time my mum made me wear a dress. She made me wear it for my 6th birthday party, and it was like horrible. So, yeah, that was the last time she made me do it outside of required parameters, I think.
Right. And then when was the first time that you sort of expressed any of this? Because it was your mum that you first came out to, wasn't it?
Yeah. In terms of sexuality, I came out quite early. So as I moved to the UK, it was probably like 12, 13. She was, okay with that. It's just like, you're part of the family, that's not going to change.
And then what about your dad?
My dad was okay about it. Basically, my mum told him, I think it's quite amusing, they probably don't, but basically she went with like hard news, soft news. She said, basically was like, your daughter's addicted to drugs and she's a lesbian. And my dad was like, I don't care who she sleeps with as long as she gets off the drugs. So that was really basically the in and out of it.
Well, I'm glad you're laughing about it now, Oscar, but I'm guessing at the time that was quite stressful for you and your family about the addiction side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I got into substance abuse at a very young age. I was just about 11, 12 years old. Yeah, I basically got into drugs when I came back to the UK. So I came back from what was a very strict conservative school environment where you like stood when the teachers talked to you and when they entered and left the room, to a high school in one of the more challenging parts of London where kids would throw things at the teacher and tell them to piss off and that sort of stuff. So it was a huge culture shock for me. And also like just coming into the UK with the levels of segregation and racism that existed compared to the country that I just come from. That was also a huge shock. But I came over, I made some friends, and within the first sort of year, we started experimenting with drugs and stuff. So looking back on it now, I see that it was a way of me coping with what was going on, but it wasn't in any way helpful to me.
So what were you doing then, if you don't mind me asking?
The short answer to that is whatever I could get my hands on.
Okay.
I guess in terms of long-term use, consistent long-term use, it was mainly pot. But there were also other drugs or substances, because they weren't all drugs, involved in that usage from about up until the age of about 30, when I decided I just couldn't do this anymore, where I was just using stuff to numb and cope with what was going on.
So were you drinking as well then?
No, I'm not a fan of alcohol, I have to say. I'm really lucky that way. I don't really drink.
So what was it eventually made you think, I can't live like this anymore?
I'd been homeless a couple of times, and I was staying at my ex's flat. She'd got a place, and I'd just spent a year with a sort of extreme kind of agoraphobia. I'd been really depressed. I'd had lots of mental health issues, and I'd spent about a year on a sofa refusing to leave the flat, and I was basically waiting to die at that point. And I just had this moment where I asked myself really honestly, if you were going to die right now, would you just let yourself go? And the answer was no. I would try and stay alive. And so I thought, well, if that's true, if I really want to live, then I should just kind of try and do that. And that was the start of a very long journey out of mental health and abuse issues, drug abuse issues.
And you think all of that was because you were struggling with your sexuality or your gender identity, or both?
My sexuality was never really an issue for me. I always saw that as a soft way out. My gender identity I struggled with a lot more. The first time I tried to broach the subject with my mum is usually the person I talk to. My dad's not very, conversational. I'd just seen a documentary about a trans guy who was going to Amsterdam for the first sort of surgeries that they were offering female to male people. And I was just like, wow, that's me, And I tried to tell my mum, and she was a bit freaked out by it. She was a bit scared by it. I remember her saying, what kind of life are you going to have? And I was so affected by her reaction that I just backtracked and kept that a secret, which I'd been doing anyway, pretty much my whole life. And so I just went back to being a lesbian for about 30 years. No, 20 years. So I came out again at 35.
Wow, 20 years of
trying to be a lesbian.
Well, you're not a very good lesbian, Oskar.
I had my moments. I probably would have been a good lesbian if I wanted to be one, if I'd wanted to stay that way. I mean, there's a certain amount of kudos that comes with being a butch woman. There's a definite, market of attraction that people, women find that attractive. And I was like...
Hot property.
Nice. Yeah, well, maybe. I don't know. I wasn't able to sort of engage with it as much, maybe to have taken advantage of that.
But you had girlfriends?
Yeah, I had girlfriends. Yeah, for sure. So I may have been a good lesbian.
So was she disapproving of? Was she more worried about how other people would accept you, I think?
Yeah, I mean, she was totally worried. I mean, as a young person, I read that reaction that she had as her being... not disapproving, but just afraid of what that meant if it was true. And obviously, when you see your parents afraid, that's quite an affecting thing as a child. Our relationship has just become really, really amazing in the last couple of years. And so I've had this conversation with her about when I first came out. A lot of it she doesn't remember. I think I basically said, I thought you were ashamed of me. And she just said, no, I'm really proud of you. I'm just amazed at what you've done with your life and that you've managed to overcome all of these things.
It was almost like you thought she was sort of disapproving, but she was doing it from a point of caring about you, I guess, wasn't she? But you didn't see that as a young person. Absolutely.
I think what she was scared. She just didn't know what to do because, at that point, I mean, I was 15, so it was...
Gosh, that's early on then. So came out as a lesbian at 13 and then as being trans at 15. That's early on.
Yeah, I mean, that was 88 when I came out, when I was 15. So literally the idea that the female-to-male transsexuals existed was a complete sort of new thing. And the only role model I had at that point was someone called Buck Angel, who was at the time a porn star. He's moved away from porn into education and sexual health and that sort of stuff. But he was really the only person I ever saw who was like what I was thinking I was. So her sort of reaction was probably just, oh my God, what am I going to do now? You know, what I needed at that point as a child was just for my parents to go, okay, that's fine, let's get on with it, you know. But I mean, really, from the time and what was available to her, you know, at the time she was a single mom putting herself through university with 3 kids, like that extra layer must have been
quite a lot to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think if I'd come out today as a young person, I have much more available to me as a way of models, seeing myself out there, to know that what I was experiencing wasn't some kind of like me going insane. A lot of my journey was coming to the realization that I wasn't making this up. It was real, and that I needed to do something about it because that was why it was affecting me.
So at what stage did you think, right, I'm ready to confront this and come out and transition?
Yeah, so once I started to deal with my substance abuse issues, I started to really start to pay attention to the things that were causing me pain and that I was trying to deal with in that way. One of the things that just kept coming up was this idea or this feeling or this experience of being male, and being identified as female was like deeply painful to me. So I needed to just stop telling myself that I was crazy and start doing something about it. And so that was kind of the step. That was about 5 years into, so 35, I was around 35 about 10 years ago.
So did you have therapy?
Not at that point.
No.
I wouldn't recommend anyone take this route, but I basically used Qigong and Tai Chi and meditation practices. I'd started going to regular classes, and they helped me to build a kind of internal stability that allowed me to keep moving forward. And then eventually I came across a charity that did personal development trainings, which were kind of like therapy, but they helped me to sort of mainly step away from this idea that I was crazy, and allowed me to, it had a process that allowed me to be able to discern what was reality and what I was making up.
So it's interesting through doing this podcast, actually, a lot of the coming out process is people coming to terms with stuff themselves, and that sounds like exactly what you were doing, really. You have to come out to yourself first and tell yourself you're not crazy, you are this.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you don't see yourself. Visibility is a hugely important thing, not just for young people who are beginning their journey, but also for people who are in their journey or have been there for a long time, because we can't understand ourselves out of relation to anyone else. When we hear other people's stories, we connect with something that they have to say because it already exists in us. And by sharing those stories, we start to understand ourselves better.
Although a lot of trans people want to go under the radar, don't they? They don't want people to know that they're passed as a different gender at all. Can you respect that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's a very difficult and complicated subject. I mean, the first thing to realise is that everyone's trans experience is different. So my experience as a trans person is completely different to somebody who might look just like me. And that is sort of a bit of a headfuck for everybody involved who's not in that experience. Even me, sometimes I make assumptions about other trans people. I talked to a friend of mine, and they basically said the problem is not that you are in the wrong body or you have problems with your gender. The problem is that society doesn't have the scope to understand your experience, and so they make us wrong. Our experience of gender as trans people, or my experience of gender as a trans person, is incredibly unique in the sense that I am not attaching my deep identity to that gender. Now, other people who are trans really identify with their gender. They're very binary, And they don't want to be reminded of a time when they were traumatized continually by being identified in the wrong way. I mean, if you go to a little toddler girl or a little toddler boy, and you go, oh, that's a really sweet little boy when it's a girl, and just watch how they react to that. Now, that is what's happening inside of a trans person every time you misgender them, because they are just trying to keep that contained in order to function in society. You know.
So when you were, you've gone through the processing and you've got off the drugs, what was the process like for you in terms of coming out and having that conversation again with your mum, but years later?
That was there were a series of conversations, and it's an ongoing conversation actually with my family, because we don't live very close to each other. So a lot of my family moved back to Trinidad. I stayed here, obviously, because it's safer for me. And so they don't see me every day. They don't have a physical presence of me. And so there was a lot of time that we spent just with what you would think of as basic things, like them getting used to the fact that I was not the same person. For them, they're like, oh my God, this one day you're like you, and the next day you're telling me you're someone completely different. For me, I'd had a 35-year journey, which I'd done in secret, so they had no insight into that.
And I presume at some point you changed your name and they had to do that overnight, didn't they? Call you something different?
Exactly, yeah. So they had to deal with pronouns and different names, and I mean, I'm still working with them on that. Different members of my family, depending on how close we are, have different ways of processing that. And so, like my mum, who I speak to the most and have the closest relationship with, she's very much more in touch with what I'm doing or how I'm being than, say, my dad, who I very rarely speak to because he isn't a very verbal person. So he still calls me by my old name and still uses my female pronoun. But that's like, in my world, not in everybody else's world. In my world, I allow that, because they're the people who've spent their lives with me.
But then how long have you lived as Oskar?
I've been Oskar now for about 8 years.
8 years is a long time to be misgendered, though, right?
Well, I've been misgendered my whole life.
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing is as well, is like, my gender is not as easy as he or she. My gender is, some days I wake up and I don't feel like anything. Or some days I feel that I wake up and I like remember an older gender or stuff like that. So it's not as easy as that. It's just that when people say he, I don't feel that kind of visceral pain when someone calls me she. And I can't explain that. There's no logic to it. It's just the reality of my experience. My family, I give them special dispensation. And I do that because they have, in the best way that they can, held me as part of their family their whole lives without any kind of exceptions. That's through being gay, that's through being a drug addict, that's through being homeless, that's through generally being a massive fuck-up for a really long time. And if I can't afford some patience and compassion to them while they come to terms with my own identity, the external factors of that, because the reality is they haven't said, oh, I never want to speak to you again, you're not part of my family. Every single one of them has said, I don't care what you are part of this family. So if they misgender me, I'm like, well, this is tough, but I'm not going to...
I think that's a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, unconditional love has to go both ways. And, I mean, it's not without difficult conversations about misgendering. Like, the first time I went back to Trinidad in my masculine body, I had to say to my mum and my sister, look, we can't do misgendering in public. It's going to be a safety issue for me. And they hadn't really connected with that, So they were like, oh, yeah, we do have to really be serious about this. So it's like me explaining to them why it's important, not just like, you have to do this.
The thing about being part of the LGBT community as well is you kind of constantly coming out. So this is something that, obviously the family thing is one thing, but what experience do you have of like coming out to potential partners or coming out at work? Is that something that you're continually doing as well?
I did it a lot more when I was younger. I do it a lot less now I'm older. I kind of take the view that, particularly with my trans identity, that unless you are going to get into my pants, I'm not really interested in coming out to you.
No. But so what do you do with people that you want to get in their pants or vice versa?
Well, I'm very upfront about it.
Yeah.
It's not that I hide my trans identity either. Like, I mean, it's really difficult as a trans person. You're kind of squashed between this having to come out, because if you don't, you're a dishonest and deceitful person who's tricking people, and not having to come out, because in what other situation are you expected to divulge intimate details of yourself within the first 10 minutes of meeting a complete stranger? You know, it's like, at least give me time to work out if this person will respect me before I tell them something that's deeply personal. If I meet somebody and there's like some interest and a connection, then I will very quickly tell that person that I'm trans, because I'm not the kind of person who's interested in being deceitful. And again, that's a projection on me. That's not really how I'm being. And generally, most people don't care if they're interested in me. That's the continual surprise for me, is that most people just don't really care.
So you're saying people there, are you attracted to men and women?
Yes. Again, that's like... I was going
to say, if you're dating women, you're technically a straight man, aren't you?
Yes.
Does that feel weird?
Well, I don't really date women. I mean, again, sexuality is a discovery as much as my gender identity. And I really got, over the last year, that gender identity and sexuality are different, because I'm more attracted to men now than I am to women.
Oh, okay.
So it's like I was gay as a woman and I'm gay as a man. So...
Oh, well, you've done everything, Oskar. You've been a lesbian and a gay man. This is amazing.
Yeah, well, I kind of label myself as a pansexual, because I'm really attracted to people. I do tend to be attracted to people who are on the more masculine side. So that's androgynous masculine women, and generally most men. I don't really find any particular look unattractive, but I do find myself more intimidated by hyper-feminine women. So and that was something that I felt intimidated by as a female identified person. So that has not changed. I'm more attracted to men, but I think also there's potential that is an exploration thing as well, and it'll all kind of balance out in the end, and I'll just be back to being attracted to whoever's attractive.
So are you in a relationship at the moment?
No, I'm not really
looking.
No, I had a long-term relationship before I moved up to Manchester, and that was a very healing and deep relationship, but then the breakup was very affecting, and so what I got from that is that I wanted to really work on the relationship I had with myself. Gosh,
it sounds like you've been through almost everything in terms of sexuality and gender identity. I like to end the podcast with advice to other people, particularly people that haven't necessarily come out yet. But, I mean, there's so much to go at from yours, Oskar, but I don't know where to start, really. But what advice would you give to a young person struggling with their gender identity or even sexuality?
That is a really difficult question. I think the really important thing to understand, and sometimes that can take years, is that you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. And that this journey, whether you like it or not, requires patience. And as you allow yourself to accept yourself, more is revealed in that. So it's not something that happens very quickly, but what you need more than anything else is to love and accept yourself, because when you can do that, then the pain of other people's difficulties is less affecting, and you can see what you need to do for yourself.
So work on yourself first.
Yeah, just loving yourself is really, it's not easy to do, and it's often thrown away quite flippantly, but it's quite a rich journey once you start to get into it.
A massive thank you to Oskar for being so open and sharing his unique story with us. Please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. We'd also love to hear from you on Twitter. You can find us there at Come Out Stories. I'm Emma Goswell, and Coming Out Stories is a What Goes On media production. Next episode, you'll hear from the poet, comedian and theatre maker Jackie Hagan. She identifies as bisexual or queer, and I think it's fair to say she had a very unique answer to the question of her first childhood crushes.
My first crush was multiple. It was on, do you remember Lindsay Lusardi?
Yeah.
Like page 3 girl.
Underwear model.
Yeah, underwear model, glamour model.
Glamour model, yeah.
And Rambo. You know, Rambo, the character.
Actual Rambo?
Actual Rambo, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And Boy George. So take that, Kinsey.